So, yeah, welcome everybody to this afternoon centering around the Arctic. And it is, of course, our very special pleasure to welcome His Excellency, Ambassador Thomas Winkler, to the University of Southern Denmark, but also to the D-IAS, which is the institute we are currently in, and is a fairly new one. And yeah, we are hosting this event, James Rogers, together with me, as we are both, I would say, junior kinds of fellows at this institute. James has a background in, Arctic security, a deep interest in that one. And I am a climate scientist and oceanographer. And yeah, we were hosting this event as part of our common project about climate change and conflicts, where we see the Arctic playing a really significant role. So yes, I'm going to first of all now introduce Thomas a bit more, as he has an interesting CV, and he's a Danish diplomat, obviously, since 1988. And he had different postings in different countries and in different places, among which are Kiev and Stockholm. And he just told me that Moscow was his favorite place to work at, which was a bit, at the time, a bit exotic, I guess, but nevertheless, an interesting place for him to work. Then later on, between 2004 and 2008, he was the head of the Department of International Law at the Danish Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which sounds wild to me. And he became the legal advisor overseeing the entire legal service of the ministry. So he has also worked extensively on all matters of public international law. This includes the International Criminal Court, responsibility to protect, use force, and piracy. Wow, this is impressive too. So you were then the Danish ambassador to Russia from 2013 on, which must have been an exciting time. And you now hold the position of an Arctic ambassador of the Kingdom of Denmark. And this is, of course, very much why we invited you. And today you will talk to us about the changing Arctic challenges and answers. And I was very happy to hear that you also took interest in the IPCC report, which I was a reviewer on, and some colleagues of mine from SDU were co-authors on. So I'm very much looking forward to hearing now what you have to say to us. This presentation will then be followed by some comments from our also associated project fellow, Duncan Depledge, who comes via Zoom in because he's in the UK. But now we are hearing you, so it's the stage is yours.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation and for the presentation here. And it's great to be back in Odense. Every time I come here, something new has been built. When I was here the first time, it was actually just a field and a building. That has seriously changed. So it's good. And I must say, I also like the D-IAS idea, because as a diplomat, you do, of course, work with certain fixed instruments, but you do get to know a lot of different fields of operations, so to speak. As you heard, I'm the Arctic ambassador of the Kingdom of Denmark. I'm the senior Arctic official of the kingdom in the Arctic Council. Everybody strikes me on the head. I have to say, I of course sit there together with my colleagues from Greenland and the Faroes. So also in this respect, the kingdom is free-headed, if you could use that expression. I have to mention that apart from being the Arctic ambassador, and this is a bit insider because I have colleagues in other countries who are only the Arctic ambassador. This is all they do. They work in the Arctic Council. I'm also head of the department in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs dealing with the Arctic and North America. So when I'm truly bored, I have to look after the bilateral relations with the United States and Canada. And apart from all this, I also have all foreign policy aspects of the internal workings of the kingdom. So the whole foreign policy, security policy coordination with Nuuk and Tórshavn is also within my domain. And if you ask me what I spend most of my time on, well, I actually spend on management. I'm a manager. I have a staff. When I say I have done something, then I actually have 17 people around me who have actually done it. But I actually spend most time on the coordination with Nuuk and Tórshavn on all matters of foreign policy and security. if you want to know what I'm doing as an Arctic ambassador, and I think I'm supposed to say this, you can follow me on Twitter. Arctic Amp KOD, Kingdom of Denmark. I'm not that active, but I'm in there from time. I'm going to talk about the Arctic, of course. I'm going to talk about challenges and answers. These are my views. This is my analysis. It's not necessarily the analysis and view of my government. So take that into account before you tweet that now he said this, then I would get into trouble. But it is my own views and analysis. And I will describe the different challenges. I will spend some time on security policy. I'm not a security policy expert. I'm not a security policy guy. I have a security policy department in the ministry. They deal with all that. But of course, you cannot work as an Arctic ambassador or with the Arctic and pretend that there are not security policy issues around as well. And then I will also talk about, well, now we mentioned climate change, talk about, I think I have been bold enough to say the important challenges on one of the PowerPoints, which includes, of course, climate change. What I really want you to, let's say, leave with is, and the first part is classic diplomacy. You have to know your geography and you have to know your history. Otherwise, you will go wrong. I will talk a little bit about both of these those issues. But I think the main thing I want you to take out, remember the nuances. I mean, this to many of you will seem like obvious, but then you read the press and then you say it's not obvious. There are many nuances, like everywhere, but including in the Arctic. And if we don't get all the nuances with us, we get it wrong. And then please interrupt me. I've worked at the University of Copenhagen for many years. I'm used to being interrupted. And I will provoke you a little bit by saying last Tuesday I was at the university in Nuuk and did a lecture or a talk on the Arctic, and I was interrupted all the time. So your Greenlandic colleagues were not shy, and they really wanted to know what I was doing and why I was doing it, and so on and so forth. So please feel free. I don't know how the people online interrupt, but they may find a way of doing it. There should be a PowerPoint, right? So I have to. Nope. That worked. Geography. We have to define the region we're talking to, or we're working with. We can't do anything without knowing what we're talking about. And now I've said a question mark up there. How do we define the Arctic? And you will see a lot of lines and stuff. Don't ask me what they are. I don't know. And to be a bit frank, I don't really care in general, because there is no one definition of the Arctic. We have the definition north of the polar circle. The Arctic Council has another definition. The IMO have a third definition. There is no firm definition of the Arctic. So remember that when you hear somebody say, well, in the Arctic, it's like that. Say, what, where in the Arctic? Of course, as a diplomat, we do like that we don't have a firm definition. It gives us a certain room of maneuver, including when we have to decide and define which part of the kingdom is in the Arctic. It does give us a room of maneuver, and that's good. Of course, when we discuss specific issues, we have to know what we're talking about. When we're discussing shipping in the Arctic in the IMO, we have to know what Arctic we are talking about. This is, I have to say, especially relevant when we're talking security policy. I will get back to that. But if you talk about security policy in the Arctic, under what heading, I'm sorry, you will get it wrong. There are very, very important distinctions in geography when we're talking security policy, but I will get back to that a bit later. So we know where we are-ish. Now we have to find out who we're going to deal with. Who are the actors? And here's another map. I love maps. This is a very nice map. This is a map, as you can see, of the Arctic Ocean. We have the yellow lines. These are the 200 nautical mile boundaries of the 5 states bordering the Arctic Ocean. Very, very nice to see that if we wanted to shut off the inner of the Arctic Ocean, for instance, for especially polluting ships, we could actually do so. What's a cross? What's a cross? There's a cross on the map. North Pole. Why is it there? Is it important? Oh, like, is it important? Exactly the answer I wanted. Because if you're a politician, the North Pole is very important. Because it's very understandable. We want to own the North Pole. For the rest of us, it's just a point, right? Sure, I'll get back to that. Yeah. For the politicians, my point here is only don't get too overexcited about the North Pole. This is something that there's a lot of politics surrounding, but not so much. It's not so important in other aspects. There's a blank slide. The states. We have to, even if I may have another personal opinion about international cooperation, we have to admit that the states are still incredibly important, and we have to know them. Of course, the first group of states we have are the ones you saw on the map, the Arctic 5. It's not a firm cooperation. I have to be very, very clear on that. These are just 5 states that sometimes talk to each other because we have joint interest in the Arctic Ocean. This is a group of states. And I don't have to, say as a diplomat, this is a very nice group to be in. For the kingdom, this is a very nice place to sit. We sit with Russia, we sit with the United States, we sit with Canada. It's a very, very nice group to be in. It's also one of the few places today where Russia and the US sit at the same table. If we add some states, and we do, and we get the Arctic 8, we add these 3 states, and we have the Arctic 8 states, we have the Arctic states, who are members of the Arctic Council. Normally, it's all focused in the A8, but on certain occasions, the A5 get together, as we did in the Ilulissat in 2008, but also more recently when we negotiated the moratorium on fishing in the high seas of the Arctic Ocean, that was also an A5 initiative. But I think the important thing to take here is that the A8 are the 8 Arctic states, and the A5 is a somewhat looser group of states that meet up when we have joint interest. I would only mention one more interesting thing here, and that is if you're sitting in Brussels, you will see that 3 of the states here are members of the European Union. So these are the 3 Arctic states. So if somebody is, how should I put it, tempted to throw themselves into the dynamics of the EU on the Arctic, and it could be relevant because 5th of October, we have the updated EU Arctic policy. Remember, there are, I would almost say, only 3 Arctic EU states, whereas there's a lot of states with other interests and other geographical focus, and that has an important for the work in the EU. Now, why do you have to hear about those states? Well, I'm sorry about these blank PowerPoints. It's for, effect. Well, you have to, because we are in charge. Regardless of what somebody else says, we are the 8 states in charge. And this is not just something we claim, this is for a reason. We are the ones in the Arctic. We have our defined land territory in the Arctic. I know there's Hans Islands and a few stuff like that, but basically we know who have the sovereignty of the land in the Arctic. We have our sea territory. We basically know who have the sovereignty of the sea territory, and we have people and peoples living in the Arctic. And this is important because if any one of you, and I don't hope you do so, but any one of you start to compare the Antarctic to the Arctic and conclude that it's the same, then we will have a problem when your thesis is being graded. Because you really, and I'm not saying this just to tease or as a theoretical, there's actually people out there who think so. But of course, the Antarctic is disputed land territory. There are no people living permanently in the Antarctic. And it's, whereas the Arctic, of course, is sea. So UNCLOS, the United Nations Law of the Sea Convention, is the one regulating relations in the Arctic, of course, together with the Ilulissat Declaration that you will hear more about. Yeah. Well, I would start the other way around and say that the A8 are the members, are the state members of the Arctic Council. So that's where we start. So we are all engaged on the full Arctic agenda. The A5 are only engaged when we're talking about the Arctic Ocean. So let's say continental shelf delineation in the Arctic Ocean is the A5, whereas Iceland, Finland, and Sweden have no claims up that far up in the Arctic. So now you may sit back with the impression and everything is well, but of course it's not. We do need more cooperation in the Arctic. But I think the basic, let's say, who is in charge formula, at least seen from my desk, is very, very clear. Of course, because I expect questions on the inner workings of the Kingdom of Denmark. So I may as well take it. No, I will not take it. It's just a second. My fault. We will get back to the Kingdom of Denmark. I want to say before somebody crucify me that of course there are many other actors in the Arctic that we have to take into account. Many of them are within the Arctic Council. We have the permanent participants, representatives of the indigenous peoples of the Arctic. We have the observers. And if somebody wants to write something about the Arctic Council in the future, I would recommend that you look into the role of the observers. They are there and they're sitting there. They go to the meetings of the senior Arctic official. They don't have a right to speak or a right to do anything. They just sit there. Yeah, it would be extremely boring. You come all the way from Korea and you just sit there for a day, listen to the rest of us speaking. Of course, there are coffee breaks and stuff. But in the working groups, the observers can really do a difference. They can go in with their data, with their expertise, with their and influence the recommendations. And we have very active observers who are doing this. One of them you see up here, the European Union. She's not a formal observer to the Council. Some don't like that, but she is a de facto observer of the Council. And she's very active in all of our working groups, providing data, pushing for the right recommendations on how to react to climate change and so on and so forth. And when we have, then we have others like China who are only observing. They're sitting there, they're not going in with anything. And of course, China, I'm sure there's a lot of interest surrounding China. And let me say just here as a sort of a, well, not a derailing, what do you call it? Going in another direction. China is at the moment pretty invisible in the Arctic. I had a meeting the other day with a group of parliamentarians from the European Parliament, and they say, ooh, we hear that China is very, very active in Greenland. And I was like, what? It turned out this was based on an article from Frankfurter Allgemeine 5 years ago. This was a different Arctic, and this was a different China. This was before Trump, and during and after Trump, China has pulled a little bit back. She's still there, let's not be mistaken. China has another strategic outlook than we have. So she is still there, but she's not very visible at the moment. Not in Greenland, not in the Arctic, some in Russia, but not very much. But she is, of course, still there. So we have actors which are within the Arctic Council. We have actors outside the Arctic Council. The Arctic Economic Council. It's tempting to ask if anybody has ever heard about it. I had not until I started my job 2 years ago. These are businesses in the Arctic working on economic cooperation. It's not part of the Arctic Council. It's an independent council working solely with business representatives. We have all sorts of other organizations, Euro-Barents Council, Nordic Cooperation, regional fisheries officers. My only point being here, there's a lot of actors in the Arctic. So the same way you have to define what Arctic we are dealing with, you have to define who are the relevant actors in one or the other connection. I will get back to the UN and Monaco in a moment. And now the moment you've all been waiting for, the Kingdom of Denmark. When we're talking actors, we of course have to mention my own country, the Kingdom of Denmark. And this is made, I think, for a school class, but you can see that there are the three entities of the kingdom. I always say to my foreign interlocutors, this is where you have to be very, very careful and listen to what the Danish diplomats say. Because if I say Denmark, I only speak about this that are down here, 42,000 square kilometers. If I say the Kingdom of Denmark, I speak about the whole lot. And of course, the Kingdom of Denmark is the expression we use as the subject of international law, while we internally use the word the realm or the unity of the realm or rigsfællesskabet, if you're speaking in Danish. I'm aware that at least one person the word, but we are still using it. Nobody has told me not to use it. What I think is interesting, because I'm working with it on a daily basis, almost on an hourly basis, and there's a lot of newspaper and press and so on. I think we have to remember that we do have common values and interests within the kingdom. We may have different way of seeing things, we have different way of talking about things, but if you take all this away, and as a diplomat, sometimes you have to take all this away, we do have a common focus on the people of the Arctic, security, and now I mean security in the broad sense. If you ask the people of Greenland, what's the most popular authority of the kingdom in Greenland is, of course, the Arctic Command. And that's not because they have naval vessels with guns. That's because they are the ones who are doing the search and rescue of Greenlandic fishermen. They're the one who are doing fighting pollution whenever that happens. So there's that. I'm talking security in the very broad sense here. Mitigating climate change, clear common interest, and of course economic development and protection of the environment. So we have strong. That's the next slide, but it might. Now I'm talking about what are our interests today, and we do have a common interest in economic development of the Arctic. So as I'm not saying whether we have common approach to how you do it, I'm just saying we have this common interest to ensure the economic development of, in this case, in this case, Greenland. I think you will find part of the answer on the next slide. So we have strong common interest, and all positions that we have, and this is the last one, but not least important. This is what I spend most of my time on. This is to make sure that every time my colleague from Greenland in one of the work, who's heading the Danish or the Kingdom of Denmark delegation in one of the working groups, whenever we say something, it's coordinated with Nuuk and Torshov. So we have one view from the Kingdom of Denmark. Sometimes we do disagree on what this view should be, but then we have to talk it through. This is what we do. So it's there. But if we go to one of the debates, which is really up these days, the question of the independence of Greenland, or for that matter, the Faroes. I think it's very, very, very important for me as a Danish civil servant to say, this is the decision to be taken by Greenland or the Faroes. Danish Parliament have said that in the Act of Self-Rule of Greenland. They just have to do it in a democratic way. It's not for Denmark or the Danes to decide. This is for Greenland and the Greenlanders. Almost all the Greenlandic parties, and now we're getting closer to what you ask about, they want independence. It's in all their programs. But the question is how and when. And this is, of course, where we may differ a bit. There's a lot of Danish money going into Greenland. You see some of it here. And therefore you will see, and I still believe until somebody tells me otherwise, that the vast majorities of Greenlanders want economic viability before independence as a precondition for having independence. Your question is then how you get that economic viability. I think, as I understood you, I think that is a talk in itself, because that's a question of uranium, mining, oil, and so on and so forth. So my point here is that there is a link between economies and independence. Until then, we have the framework that we use today, and that's the one we will base ourselves on. And I would say, and I know it might be a bit provocative for such a group here, you may throw me a lot of questions about Arctic strategy or declarations. My answer will be, we're waiting for the new government in Nuuk to make up their minds. Did it answer your question or not? Okay, you can get back then. So the actors, now we go to the challengers. James, you stop me when I've spoken too long, right? Okay. Yeah, you do something. Like, well, I'm a diplomat. I just keep on speaking. That's what we do. We speak people to talk people to death. Right? So let's go to the challenges. And the first one I will focus on is security and security policy. Tension or low tension or something third. And of course here you have the buildings that is so much discussed, Nagorskoye, the Russian Air Force base in the north. And of course, if we take the next one, it gets even worse. Here you have Nagorskoye and you have the American base in Tule or Pitofic, as it should now be called. And of course, you can see, even if the map cheats, because it's still a hell of a long way away, but there is, of course, a possibility. The Russian rebuilding of their armed forces in the Arctic has been going on for many, many years. It didn't get much attention until this gentleman in Rovaniemi in May 19, Secretary of State Pompeo of the United States, went up and talked about the Arctic as a zone of conflict and conflicting interests. The driving force behind that statement was China. That was the key concern of the United States, and it still is today. This, I think most people agree today, this was the wrong statement, the wrong place, the wrong time. But even if you hear that, make no mistake that the analysis behind Pompeo, and I will get back to Trump's offer to buy Greenland, that has not changed. The rhetoric may have changed, but the conflict with China as the main geopolitical conflict has not changed. As I said, I'm not a security policy expert. I will let you make up your own mind. I will just point to a few things you have to remember when you analyze security policy in the Arctic. And the first one is no surprise. It's a definition of what we're talking about. There's a huge difference on whether we're talking security policy in the North Atlantic, including the parts of the North Atlantic which are in the Arctic, the famous GIUK, Greenland, Iceland, UK gap. This is some of us who are old enough to remember part of the Cold War do remember this sort of approach to security policy in the North. If we're talking about the Arctic Ocean, it is a different story also security-wise. If we're talking defense of Greenland, it's the third story. If we're talking about right of free passage in the Northern Sea Route, it's a completely different story. That's perhaps the one place where you can be sure that an armed conflict will break out if somebody really tests that. It's also interesting enough on 2 points. This is the one point when somebody asked me, what is the position of the Danes on the legal regime of the Northern Sea Route and the Northwest Passage? And it's our very, very firm policy not to have a policy. The second point is that this is one place where the Canadians and the Russians may agree vis-a-vis the United States. So in my view, when you talk security policy, it's too broad just to say the Arctic. And now I put in an article who agrees with me. This is always nice. Somebody agrees with me. So I'm sure we can send these PowerPoints around afterwards. So you can click on the link. It's a very, very interesting article. It seemed from a very Danish defense perspective, but I still think the main point is important. We also have to remember that some military assets have always been up there. The nuclear carrying submarines have always been there. Cold War, after the Cold War, now. The Northern Sea Fleet of Russia has always been up there to defend the nuclear submarines. So let's be careful not to, let's say, overdo the buildup. And then there are some new assets, definitely. But we have to see that they are mainly homeland security. And I will make two, I don't know if it's anecdotes, but analysis in this respect. When Russia placed her first very, very modern anti-aircraft batteries, I don't know, S-400, whatever, up in the Arctic, some of us in Moscow asked them, what on earth are you doing? We have to keep the Arctic as a zone of low tension. And the answer was, but Mr. Ambassador, this is where the B-52s and the cruise missiles are coming from. This is defense against a US attack. The same if you take Trump's offer to buy Greenland. I'm not allowed to say that word because it's political no-go, but you all know what we thought about that. But the analysis behind, if you're sitting in Washington and you're looking north, there's a hole in the defenses, which is Greenland. And of course, Trump being Trump, he said, let's buy it and build something. And that didn't went very well. But that analysis from the US side is still there. It's homeland security for both of them. Of course, also, I don't think it's news to anybody. Of course, we have to all the time ask the difference between can and will. The fact that you have capacities is not the same as that you will use the capacities. The Danish intelligence service, military intelligence service, have said about the Russian buildup that it's mainly defensive, even if it do have offensive elements. So you have to ask the question, why would anybody use military might in the Arctic? There's even more you have to remember. I'm sorry about that. You have to look behind the headlines, for God's sake. I'm sorry. This quote, "The Arctic is ours," was what the Danish and other Western press got out of a speech by Foreign Minister Lavrov of Russia. And it's a bit like when we say Putin wants to go to war because he said the fall of the Soviet Union was the worst disaster ever. We forgot the next sentence because it left hundreds of thousands of Russians outside Russia. The same here, the Arctic is ours. Yes, he was talking about the fact that Russia fills up 2/3 of the Arctic. And his point was, we are building up our military defensive capacities within our territory, unlike others, was perhaps also his point. But you can interpret his statement as you want. I just think it's important to get all the nuances with you, and it's not only about Mr. Lavrov. So my thesis, and I will continue that until somebody really shows me in reality that I cannot imagine a conflict about the Arctic. I cannot imagine anybody in the Arctic using military force because of issues pertaining to the Arctic. 20% of the Russian gross national product originates from the Arctic. They don't want a conflict up there. That's the last thing they want. That's not the same as to say we can never have a conflict in the Arctic. Yes, we can have a conflict in the Arctic, but it will be the Arctic as one area of conflict together with a lot of areas in case, which we hope not, of course, that the geopolitical situation gets out of hand. So my conclusion is that there are nuances. You cannot say there's high tension, there's low tension. We still, and we said it in Reykjavik, all 8 of us, we had shared the ambition of low tension, but of course, there is tension and there is increased military activity in the Arctic. The challenge for the diplomats is, how do we avoid misunderstandings? I mean, diplomats, at least a diplomat like myself, I hate this military hardware because, you know, it goes wrong. The risk that something goes wrong. We saw it in the Baltic Sea some years back, where we had a lot of near misses and stuff like that. The Arctic is a much bigger area. The risk is significantly smaller, but we do need a system to call each other if something goes wrong. We don't have such a system today. The Arctic Council cannot deal with security policy. She should not deal with security policy because that would pollute the rest of the agenda. But this is one of the areas where, for instance, the Danish government is working hard to see if we can find a solution. And I just note that it would not make sense if Russia is not at that table. So we have to find a place where we all 8 can sit and make sure that we avoid misunderstandings. I think I have time to do, plenty of time. Arctic is much more than security policy. That's not a surprise for you, right? When you hear it from me. I just can't help saying, and this is my point on history, that we've been in crisis before. Somebody already mentioned the flag at the bottom of the sea, and this is just because I love this guy. This is Mr. Chilingarov, Mr. Polar of the Russian Federation, now 81. So 10, 12, 13 years ago, when he personally took the flag to the bottom of the seabed at the North Pole, he was an elderly gentleman. He's a hero of Russia and of course, of the Soviet Union. And he did that back in the summer of 2007. And as somebody sort of indicated, panic broke out in the government offices around the Arctic, because some thought that now Russia would claim the North Pole because they had their flag there. I can then tell you it's never been used legally or politically in any context. It was a science expedition, and the point was to prove to the Russian population that they could still do it. So that was one thing that happened in this summer of 2007, where I frankly didn't know much about the Arctic back then, apart from doing continental shelf issues. What this was all about is, of course, this one again. We want the North Pole. This is not something, this again is a talk in itself. I just want, because we are D-IAS, I just want to know that when I took over as head of the Department of International Law, and my Law of the Sea advisor came in and said, you have to work with the Law of the Sea. And I was like, oh my God, really? Because I remember that from teaching, but it is so interesting. And this is one area where science, law, and politics meet. When Denmark gave in her submission along the Lomonosov Ridge in the summer of 2014, we went all the way to the 200 nautical mile zone of the Russian Federation. I think I'm not overdoing when I say they got pretty pissed. And I was called to a very special place in Moscow where you don't want to go on your own. No, it sounds like it was a torture chamber. It was not. It was still diplomacy. But I was called, and I got a really, really good working over orally by my Russian colleagues. What does this small state think they're doing? How did we solve that? We invited in the scientists. The Danish and the Russian scientists, they've all been on the same icebreaker, sleeping in the same cot, being lost somewhere in the Arctic. And we sat them down and they talked to each other, and then they were like, they didn't like it. But we got the tension diffused. So this is one example of where this Law of the Sea, the whole continental shelf issue, is really, really a mix of areas meeting. We could also do this drawing of Greenland and the Arctic being cut into pieces by different people. Fortunately, it's still so that we are all doing the continental shelf in the Arctic Ocean by the book. So there's no, at the moment, conflict potential there. But, and this is my important point in history, this was not all that happened in the summer of 2007. What also happened was that the Prince of Monaco, for reasons still a bit beyond my understanding, apparently he was interested in this, he said, this is like the Antarctic, we need an Arctic treaty. This caused panic. I mean, the flag caused panic among the politicians, because that was sort of very easy to see. This caused panic among the civil servants as well, especially when the UN said, yes, that's a good idea. And then the Arctic state had some way, had to say no, and that's what we did with the Ilulissat Declaration back in 2008. This was an A5 initiative. It only dealt with the continental shelf in the Arctic Ocean. We got it confirmed again in 2018 by the A8. But the main point of this declaration, I drafted it, I love it, it's still being referred to, that's rare in diplomacy. But the main point is, in fact, the first one I said up here, we will manage the Arctic responsibly. This sounds good, but it was a very clear signal to the rest of the world that we, as I said some time ago, we are in charge. And we expressed in 2008. No security. Now we go to this, what I a little bit provoking said, the other challenges. The ice is melting. I mean, the IPCC report, I mean, if you go in on this interactive map and start to click, I mean, you have to be in a good mood beforehand, because you become in a very bad mood when you see what's going to happen in the Arctic with the melting of the ice in, let's say, the foreseeable future. I know for scientists, that's 2041 to 2060, but that's still quite close in time. This will have a serious effect on everything, well, globally. I leave that to you, but globally, but of course also in the Arctic. Their living conditions are changing dramatically. We see, when you see a conflict between the Faroese, the EU and Norway on mackerels. Well, it's not, it's because the fish start to migrate in different patterns because the climate is changing. And this causes conflict, right? So this is not something to be taken. Of course, the problem for the Arctic states is we are not going to solve this on our own. This is a global issue. It has to be solved. We said that in Reykjavik very, very clearly. But of course, we have to, as I said some slides ago, we have to, in our own states, to try to mitigate the negative effect of climate change, which is not necessarily easy. It gives us new opportunities, but they bring also challenges. Again, it's not a black and white picture. You will find many in the Arctic say, woo, it's opening up. We can get access to the resources in an easier way. We can get more tourists. That also causes challenges on how to protect the environment, for instance, and the economic sustainability. The priority, now you can challenge me again, for the region, they want and they need economic and social development, but not at all costs. And again, if I should recommend a study the previous Greenlandic government and the new Greenlandic government and their approach to this very, very difficult balance between development and protection of the environment. There has been some changes, I would hint like that. Well, it's both. It's of course an opportunity because some of the resources are becoming more accessible. But let's remember all the time we're still in the Arctic. I mean, it's still a hostile environment. So yes, they want more tourists, but they're scared by the Icelandic example of tourists, well, destroying the tourist side, but also pressing the housing prices in Reykjavik to a ridiculous level. So that's what I said. There's really a balance here. You also have to combine it if you're in Greenland with the sort of city countryside discussion. Can you maintain the original way of life if the seals and the polar bears are disappearing? Difficult. So shouldn't we just close these small communities, as Chemnitz said in Parliament? That was very unpopular. So there's no answer where you can say they want it. But of course, many of you would have noticed that the new government has made a ban on oil and gas exploitation in Greenland. They have made or have decided to make some kind of ban on uranium exploitation in Greenland. So I would say the new government have chosen in many ways the environment over the economic development, or rather they want the economic development to be in other areas. It's a bit unclear where it should be, and it's not so easy, but so there's a clear difference there between the two governments. Whew, I'm almost done now, because now we've done all the challenges, right? Now we know about the Arctic and we know about the actors in security policy, and I don't know what. What is then the answer? Well, it will not be surprised for anybody in this room, having listened to me, that the answer, of course, is international cooperation. There's no way, none of the Arctic states, including Russia, who can deal with all these challenges on her own. I would also say, but this is again my position as representing the cooperating Arctic, cooperation is a good way of addressing tensions. The more we talk, the less tensions. It's not necessarily true one-to-one, because it's different groups doing the two things. But we do believe that when we're sitting in the Arctic Council, we do contribute to maintaining low tension in the region. We have a lot of good cooperation between the states. Now I've put our famous Hans Island up here. There was a crisis back in 2005. I was sitting in my car going on summer vacation when my boss called me and said, Canada has invaded us. And I was like, how is that possible? Because none of us, to be frank, had ever heard about Hans Island, apart, of course, from my law of the sea expert. But now we have a process between states and it will be resolved. Banana Hole is the continental shelf north of the Faroes. the Lomonosov Ridge, it's the continental shelf in the Arctic Ocean. On all these areas, states are cooperating. We're also cooperating daily. This is where I put in my research project, so I did remember them, that we do have researchers, scientists from all over the world cooperating daily in the Arctic. I'm not saying it's a dance on roses, of course not. There's still issues on data exchange and stuff like that, but it is taking place to a very, very large extent. And then, of course, this is between states. I've said what I want to say on security policy cooperation. You can ask if you want to. And there is a lot of international cooperation. Now I picked some of the organizations dealing with the Arctic. And of course, as the Danes in the room with notice with interest that the kingdom is the only Arctic state who is a member in all of these organizations. So we have what we call it in diplomacy, a sort of an edge, that we have a better level of information than many of our colleagues. And now we are almost getting there, but I have to mention my favorite organization. I'm the senior Arctic official of the kingdom in the Arctic Council, and it's you are welcome to challenge me if you've ever heard about it. It's an underrated organization. There's a lot of information here. You don't need to focus on that. But what we have to notice is a traditional intergovernmental cooperation. These are 8 independent states exchanging views, getting a lot of recommendation from our experts. At the end of the day, it's up to the individual state to decide whether she wants to do one or the other. I would claim, but I'm sure there will be some political scientists analyzing what we did in Reykjavik in May, that we were not only back on track, as I say here, but we actually progressed a little bit. And some of you will ask, what is SMM, MPA, or SSA? Don't worry about it. SMM is the South Marine Mechanism. MPA are marine protected areas. Do we like them? Copenhagen does, Nuuk does not. The Russians don't. Is there another way we can responsibly manage living resources in the Arctic than the UN MPAs? I'm not saying whether there is. I'm just saying this as an example of an area where we as Arctic state, I think, will be forced to show that we can work together and not just be individual states if we want to prevent UN mechanism on this area. So, claiming that the Arctic Council is back on track, and then, of course, ending with one of the usual idyllic pictures from the Arctic. So, now I use my time-ish, right? So, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Winkler. Thomas, Christian, are we able to go straight through and to... And how do we get that through? Not on here. I want it on this screen so everyone can see Duncan as well. Okay. And do what? Okay, great. Start pressing buttons erratically, and then something's bound to happen. Yes. Well, while that gets sorted out, I will introduce our next session. And I will start by saying that thank you for all of you have come in person and those of you who have come here online as well. It is great to see around 60 people attending this event, and this is why we do these in a hybrid format at the moment, hopefully transitioning to full in-person events at some point in the future, but perhaps that won't be the case. Either way, it's great to have you to be able to engage, and you can ask questions on the chat as well, and we'll come through to those. Perfect, thank you, Christian. Now, we've decided to move through to a small commentary section, as we have, as part of our project here at the University of Southern Denmark at D-IAS, one of our affiliates, Dr. Duncan Depledge. He is one of the world's leading experts on Arctic security, and I'll be bold enough to say that Duncan is the UK's leading expert on Arctic security. He served as the special advisor to the UK's House of Commons Defence Committee during its inquiry on UK defence in the Arctic. He was also the first director of the all-party parliamentary group on polar regions in Westminster, and he helped to establish that. He's one of the founders, and he still holds an advisory role there. Now, there's also another thing to note about Duncan, and that is he is in many ways a son of Odense, having been brought up here for many years during his youth, as his father Michael was a professor here. He's also recently published 2 new books, which are open access and free to access online, and both are visiting D-IAS fellow, Professor Carolin Kennedy-Pipe, and my good self have been involved in those projects, and those books are Great Power Competition in the Anthropocene Arctic and On Thin Ice, ? Perspectives of Arctic Security. And we will tweet out about those, direct links to them, so you can access them for free from our D-IAS Twitter, which is at Danish IAS. However, I will hand over to Duncan now to make some comments in reply to Ambassador Winkler's talk. And while we're doing that, please make a note of your own questions when we open up for our Q&A session afterwards. Duncan, over to you.
Thank you, James. Can you hear me okay? Can you hear me okay? Am I coming through? Can you hear me?
You're good to go, Duncan.
Okay, terrific. Okay, well, thank you, James, for that very kind introduction. It really is an honor and a privilege to join you, albeit virtually. And I was struck listening to the ambassador's introduction when he was saying how much Odense has changed every time he visits. I'm kind of trying to cast my mind back to what I remember of Odense 27 years ago, and picturing what it might look like today. It was a really excellent presentation from the ambassador, and I'm grateful to have the opportunity to make a few comments. The ambassador did a great job, I thought, of setting out the changes that we're witnessing in the Arctic. And in some ways, I'm not sure how much there is actually left to say, but I will try. And reflecting on the ambassador's remarks, I think there are probably 3 things that I would like to highlight, or at least spin in a slightly different way, just to offer a different perspective. And the first of those is, throughout the ambassador's remarks, I was casting my mind back to sort of 10, 15 years ago when I first started getting interested in the Arctic, and thinking about how the region was being described, and how diplomats were talking about the region, and how we were understanding the region in various fora, such as the multitude of Arctic conferences that are always going on. And this is something I've been reflecting on a lot recently. And so 2 things jumped out at me from the ambassador's remarks. The first was, and I apologize for paraphrasing, and I hope I don't disrupt the meaning too much. But the first thing was when the ambassador said that we know who the Arctic belongs to, and it's the 8 Arctic states. Now, I have some sympathy for that view, but maybe this is my outsider perspective. I also think it's important to remember that when we're thinking about multiple Arctics, as the ambassador set out, that there are Arctics where non-Arctic states like the UK, like China and others do have clear and legitimate interests, where they are to some extent equal to the Arctic states, and questions of primacy become a lot more complicated. And I think if you want one example of that, the A5+5 fisheries agreement, which didn't actually encompass all of the Arctic states, but did encompass several actors from beyond the region, really does speak to that. And thinking back 10 years, I think that primacy of the A8 was probably on much more secure footing than it is now. And of course, what we've witnessed over the past 10 years is substantial rise in the amount of international interest in the region and growing understanding of what rights and interests the rest of the international community might have in the region on quite legitimate terms. And so when it comes to thinking about more cooperation in the Arctic, we also have to think about the fact that there are now more players in the Arctic, and these other countries do matter. And I'll come back to the significance of this with a later point. The second thing that the ambassador said that was striking was that you cannot talk about the Arctic without talking about security policy challenges. He noted that the Russian military buildup in the Arctic didn't really get very much attention until 2018. Well, partly the reason for that, as I see it, is that that's because it was practically taboo to talk about it. I remember being in workshops and forums in 2008, 2009, even later, where if you wanted to talk about Russian military activity, or if you wanted to talk about security problems, you were instantly told that no, the Arctic is all about peace and cooperation, and we're not interested in those things. By even talking about it, what you are doing is generating some kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. Now, maybe that's exactly what we've done, and that's why we're in the situation now. Or maybe there was just an element of heads in the sand slightly about whether or not, or in the ice, I should probably say, about whether or not these are things that we should be talking about. Having said that, I agreed with most of the ambassador's analysis about the security situation in the Arctic, and I think that was important. And I would certainly build on that by really saying that we're all aware of this popular refrain about high north, low tension. But this was a phrase that it seems to me was born in the period 2008, 2009, when there were a lot of outlandish claims about the Arctic as a new Wild West. That was essentially doomed to anarchy and conflict over all the new treasures that were being uncovered in the region. But when we hear this refrain today, and I'm glad that the ambassador argued for something more nuanced, because I wonder whether this refrain really now takes account of the inversion that the ambassador actually described. An inversion of the way that the Arctic is framed as a security problem, no longer so much about the Arctic being a source of conflict, but far more about how the Arctic is being drawn into wider conflicts that are ongoing within Europe, but also at a global level if we start to think about the US-China competition. And so I think our principal concern now is how we actually manage, and I choose that word carefully because I'm not someone who subscribes to the idea of Arctic exceptionalism. I don't think we can insulate the Arctic from this in any particular way. But we do need to think about how we manage the way in which the Arctic is brought into that more global or regional strategic competition. The second broad point I want to make is about the word change and this idea of a changing Arctic. We've known for decades that the Arctic is changing. The problem is we don't know what it's changing into. And I've seen it suggested in debates about climate change that even the term climate change is not that useful. We should be thinking about climate uncertainty. And I wonder if that's the same for the Arctic, that actually what we need to get our heads around is the idea of an uncertain Arctic. Related to this, it's striking, I think, that the geopolitics of the region has been slow to catch up with the physical changes that we've seen unfolding in the region. And Ambassador, you said that there's no need for new international regulation. I think I understand what you're saying there, particularly in relation to those who call for an Arctic treaty. And I fully agree with you there. But if we extend that to think about, does that mean that what we're really talking about in the Arctic is preserving, protecting, defending the status quo? Then I perhaps have some more questions, because I would say that the status quo simply cannot hold. There is too much change unfolding in the region. There is too much uncertainty. And if that's the case, Should we now be thinking more in terms of how we shape the future order in the Arctic, rather than simply trying to hold on to what we had in the past? Indeed, and again, outside this perspective, this seemed to be the message that I took away from the recent integrated review conducted by the British government, because that document was very clear that while we need to hold on to the things that we think we can hold on to in terms of the rules-based international order, we also need to think more carefully about competing for the things that we want to change and how they should change. My last point, which is also partly a question to your ambassador, is, do you think we still have a shared vision for the Arctic? Did we ever have one? Now, I might be oversimplifying this a little bit, but 25 years ago, when the Arctic Council was established, it seemed to me at least that there was something of a common vision of the Arctic. There were shared concerns centered on sustainable development, on environmental protection, on the needs of those living in the region, which were common across the Arctic states. And beyond that, we didn't have too much interest in the region. We can, again, argue about specific parts of the Arctic in that, where there might have been commercial and military activity lingering on. But by and large, we were talking about the same things. And I think there was a common view of where we wanted to go, the Arctic to go, that was inclusive, particularly of Russian perspectives. But that vision, I think, was rooted in what we might call a unipolar worldview of the future international order that emerged out of the Cold War that we saw in the 1990s, or at the very least a vision of the Arctic which accommodated the views of all the circumpolar states, including Russia, as I mentioned, or at least did so in a way that they could tolerate. So even if they weren't necessarily happy with all of the terms, they could tolerate it. It was accommodating of what they wanted as well, and they felt like partners of the region. And I just wonder if the big shift we've seen now is that, you know, this is not still the case today. There isn't this shared vision. What we see among Western states, among Russia and China, are very different ideas of what the Arctic should be and what it should look like in the future. And if that's the case, then we need to think carefully about whether these competing visions are compatible. What prospect is there of common ground being found in an increasingly multipolar rather than unipolar world? And this is where I go back to my first point about the non-Arctic states. How inclusive does this vision need to be? Is it just for the Arctic states? Or does that vision need to actually be shared beyond the region if it's going to have any traction and any sort of success, even if the Arctic states are still retaining primacy in it? So I think these are the questions that we need to be thinking about, because it seems to me that the various actors that we've been discussing are much further apart now in terms of what they think the Arctic should look like than they were 25 years ago. And I'll end my remarks there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Duncan. So I suppose that's your first question, Ambassador, is how inclusive does this cooperation have to be into the future? And I guess, is there such a thing as a near Arctic state?
Sure. Well, thank you, Duncan. I think that were very good points all along, and I think it's now I can't see you, but you can see me. But, it was incredibly refreshing to get a view from outside the Arctic, and I don't think I was especially surprised by some of the points you made. Before I go to this part of should we be more inclusive, I really think one of the very interesting questions you raised, Duncan, is whether we want to preserve status quo in the Arctic. I've actually never thought about it, but when I look back at the work we're doing, there is a lot of status quo guarding in it. I think part of it is due to the permanent participants and the indigenous peoples, but there's also from the states, I think, a sort of status quo approach, even if we do know that things are changing. And that's perhaps where when you say, is there a shared vision, I still do believe there is a shared vision, but it again, it's perhaps it's much more nuanced than it was 25 years ago. And there are many more differences than there used to be. Of course, you would expect a diplomat like me to say, and I will say it, I believe the documents we got out of the Reykjavik ministerial were very strong documents. It was, of course, in the background that we didn't get anything out of Rovaniemi in 2019. And that's why, perhaps the main reason why you will hear diplomats say we're back on track. I do think the documents reflect a shared vision, but they also reflect, as you dig even deeper into them, many, many more differences than we had 25 years ago, and perhaps even 5 years ago. And I think one of the most interesting parts to dig into are the transition to green energy, where the differences between the Russian, to some extent the American and the European approach become incredibly visible in the text, in the sense that it's watered down to almost no specific action. I mean, you will not hear a Danish diplomat stand here and say, yeah, sure, we'll give up the Arctic Council and open it for everybody else. I don't think that's going to happen. I think you got a point in saying, if we should establish, or you don't have, I'm paraphrasing, if we should establish an Arctic Council today, that would be a completely different process. And I don't think we would succeed, actually, if I should be a bit blunt. So there you will find the diplomat being very pro status quo and say, we have the Arctic Council, we're sitting there, we're talking, all these different states, including Russia and the United States, to a large extent, common agenda, but of course with increasing differences. We want to be inclusive. I don't think you will see the Arctic Council opening up for more than the current observers system that we have. Thank you.
Do you have any additional comments in response to Duncan?
Oh, there was a lot of things, but of course, Duncan, just to be absolutely clear, I totally agree with your, let's say, the history. I mean, it's only after certain events in 14 that we start to look at the Russian military buildup in the Arctic, at least in a broader sense. And it goes back to what I said. If we were going to build an Arctic Council today, that would be a completely different things. You will still hear, you will not get a Danish diplomat to say that we may need new regulatory instruments. I mean, you can always do it, and we did one on scientific cooperation in the Arctic Council. But of course, you're right that if you then take, let's say, the North Atlantic, including the Arctic, that may be a different issue, and we may need new regulatory instruments there. What I'm calling for is more to have the practical cooperation. I have a legal background. I love treaties and agreements, and we can spend years negotiating them. But I would prefer that we have some telephone numbers so the right people can call the right people if something strange is happening. We don't really have that, at least not in the security and military field at the moment, and that's perhaps a lack, which may not concern me in the Arctic Ocean, but it may concern me in the Barents Sea area and the Arctic part of the North Atlantic. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Cooperation is key. Christian, could we move and thank you so much, Duncan, for your comments. You've really given us food for thought there, and we'll move through to the questions that we have in-house. Would you mind pinning the ambassador's screen to the front? Thank you, Christian. I want you there. Oh, yeah, absolutely. You now face the firing squad of the floor. Okay, wonderful. We have our first question. Would you mind introducing yourself and asking your question?
Thank you. First of all, thank you to both speakers for your interventions. My name is Fred Harhoff. I am Professor Emeritus now in international law, and I would like to get back to the points raised by Duncan and also commented by Thomas, because it seems to me that everybody, or the international community as a whole, is quite satisfied with the way things are, because we have a small state, namely Denmark, in possession of the Greenlandic territory, thus, which of course is an important part. And I think that the other big nations in the world are quite happy, content with the fact that it's a small country who sits on Greenland. If that were to change, I think we would start having someone say, you know, you're rocking the boat. So as long as Greenland stays under Danish wings, everybody is happy. They can sit back quiet, knowing that nothing radical is going to happen. It's fine. Denmark is not inclined to play a major role in the security policy of the Arctic, and certainly not in the world. So having a small boy sitting on Greenland, Denmark, makes everybody feel sort of at ease for the moment. So my question to you is, what is going to happen if, as we expect, the United States will no longer be able or willing to play the role of the global policeman? It looks as if the US is kind of pulling out of insisting of pulling out from the viewpoint or from the position of having to play the major security role in the world. Now they're backing away from that, and my question to you is, what will the impacts of that possibly be in the Arctic or for Greenland?
Duncan, would you like to have a response to that?
Yeah, I mean, let me just sort of jump in there. I mean, I think it was, I wasn't entirely sure I understood the question, but I think really just, it was an interesting remark that it might be in, say, Russia, China, and the US's joint interest for Greenland to remain part of the Kingdom of Denmark. I wasn't quite sure what the link was then to the US no longer being the global policeman. But if we take the question of Greenlandic independence as the starting point, and what does that mean, then I think what's intriguing about it is that the, you know, with Greenlandic independence, that there will be an interesting question about who has influence in the region, and the ambassador said that China isn't very visible yet in the Arctic, and clearly one of the questions that remains to be answered is, what is the level of Chinese ambition in Greenland? Because if that's quite substantial, then you could easily imagine that there would be tension between the US and China over the future of Greenland, which would be it would be interacting with the Greenlanders' own position in terms of building themselves up as a nation, and so that would certainly be a complicated issue to try to unravel. But on the other hand, if China's interest remains low, then I think then I'm not sure where the Greenlandic issue really comes in, because either, you know, Greenland will choose a future for itself where it remains more closely aligned to Europe, or it will perhaps shift its focus towards North America. But either way, I don't see that being a particular source of tension.
Thank you, Duncan. Ambassador, I don't know if you want to respond to that question.
I don't know how much I have to add to that. I think you have a point for in many. Well, now we just had the status quo discussion. In many thinking that status quo, including the way the states are.
Isn't it interesting, because in Greenland does declare independence, Denmark is an Arctic state.
No, sorry. Of course, this is interesting for us in Denmark, and we are aware of that, and that's, Denmark is only an Arctic state because of Greenland, and so if Greenland declares independence, Denmark, you won't have to look at me, but that's.
in how the United States might perceive the situations?
Definitely. But there's not much I can do about that. No. Well, I mean, my job is, of course, to have as close a cooperation with my Greenlandic colleagues as possible, so that they feel or have the impression, at least, that we from Copenhagen wants to assist them with whatever they want. So that's part of my job. Whether they, as I said, want to become independent, what kind of affiliation they want is, of course, their decision. But for sure, it would have, should that they come, consequences for the kingdom.
And we have exactly the same discussions as we know in my country, that if Scotland should declare independence, that blows out of the water our claim to be a near Arctic state, or the closest neighbour.
Sure.
So these independence, whether it's Greenland or Scotland, have profound security consequences. And there is a bigger question. Sorry for interrupting.
No, I agree with you, but still, I mean, we have to say that the decision of independence is a decision by Greenland or the Faroes. So I just want to make one comment to your second point, for like that. Wait a minute. Just I think that it's not by nothing I do is by coincidence, but it's not coincidence that I said homeland security up there. I'm not sure that the US engagement in the Arctic is a question of being a policeman, or this is very, at least that I see it, hardcore security of the North American continent. And that I do not believe will change regardless of what may change in the US sort of wider role globally. The fact when you look north and see the rockets coming, that will not change.
My point was that if the US is pulling out from the role as the global policeman and backing up, would they then what I was trying to.
Yeah, I'm not sure there's a link between the two things. So I think let's say the concern of the United States for the security of the North American continent, perhaps, depends on the actions by Russia and China and others. And of course, if they see a substantial increase in the threat, I also see a substantial increase in the US engagement, security-wise in the Arctic and also in Greenland. I think it's sort of depending not so much on what they do elsewhere, but I would just say that I still think that that's what you're hinting to. I mean, the main geopolitical development we have right now is the relationship between the US and China. I don't see that changing. I mean, they may step down in their role as international policemen elsewhere, but I don't see them stop countering the Chinese influence, including globally. So as Duncan also hinted, if we suddenly see a renew, because China was in the Arctic 5-6 years ago, they pulled a bit back. I'm convinced that their interest in the Arctic are unchanged, and they may come back in. And if we suddenly see a more, let's say, aggressive China, for instance, vis-a-vis Greenland and investments and economic cooperation, then I'm sure we will also see a reaction from the US. Thank you.
Ambassador, you asked for probing questions, so we're going to keep them coming at you. Do we not see the Danish investment of 1.5 billion Danish crowns into largely drones, surveillance and satellite capabilities used for and in the Arctic region from the Faroe Islands and Greenland as being a response to that increased Chinese interest earlier on 6 years ago and that increased US interest in the region? Has Denmark not already reacted, and was it not a defense investment reaction?
Of course we had. I think I had it somewhere in my speech that we I mean, when I said more cooperation, this is not, luckily I wrote challenges and answers. There is more than one answer. For my part of the shop, so to speak, the answer is more cooperation. But of course, from our military and security policy wise, the fact that there is an increased activity, to use that expression, in the region, including around Greenland, of course, military activity, but also increased civilian activity, of course, gives us an obligation. We, now I'm talking Denmark, is obliged to defend the territory of the whole kingdom. And not only vis-a-vis NATO, but also sort of vis-a-vis the population. And what you see with the Arctic Capacity Package is an answer to that. So I'm not saying, I don't see us as how should I put it, pacifistic in the sense that we will only cooperate and only sit and talk. No. We know things are changing. We know we need more surveillance, partly for military reasons, but also for civilian reasons, because we have an increased traffic, and we're back to the term I use, security in the broad term. There's an increased risk of accidents in the Arctic, especially at sea, and we need to have more resources there, simply. So please don't get me wrong. I'm not saying we should not react to a Russian and Chinese or potential Chinese military buildup. Of course we should, and of course this is what we're doing, but we're doing it on surveillance and not on, let's say, more offensive means.
Ambassador, thank you. It's a really important point to clarify. I now pass over to one of our DS fellows, Carl Attard, who is a Arctic ice scientist. So I'm not sure if Carl will continue on the defense theme, so you may be relieved to know. I'll pass you over to Carl.
Thank you, James. Yes, so my question is more about research in the Arctic, and we know there are a lot of nations participating and having the capabilities to do research, and it goes back to sort of your comment about about an Arctic treaty and what the Prince of Monaco mentioned. And we know that the Prince of Monaco has science, you know, he's really passionate about science and about understanding the natural world. And you know, as scientists, we often think about, okay, what are the most interesting places to visit from a scientific perspective, and how are we going to study them? So we might get on an icebreaker and go up north and then head over, you know, to Russia in our minds, and then go up to the North Pole to study ocean currents and whatever might be interesting. And I've been on some of these expeditions, and I know that plans change sometimes because of diplomatic issues. So I wonder whether an Arctic treaty, you know, in the same sort of way that we have an Antarctic treaty for research, could be useful in that respect, in enabling science to happen on a broader scale. Thank you.
Well, I would be a bit provocative and ask you back, don't we already have one? The Arctic Council did a treaty on scientific cooperation 3-4 years ago. But as you can hear, I only know it because we are the formal depositor of this treaty in Copenhagen. But I think there is some kind of, or there is an Arctic Council treaty. I don't know how far it reaches, and that may be, I mean, be your point. I mean, as I hope you heard, I'm all for scientific cooperation. It's very helpful in the diplomatic world, and of course, it has a right in its own in trying to predict what's going to happen. And all we see from our Arctic Council working group is scientists recommending the states to take the right steps to prevent too many negative effects of climate change. To use one example. Again, I'm not sure that the answer is formal documents. I'm really personally quite convinced that the only answer to ensure an even stronger scientific cooperation are the interactions between science. I know they are there all along. I use my example from Russia. More, please. I mean, that's my reaction to that. I would also say, I mean, I think science, as I say, play an important role, but also think, and this is a point I've repeated at many conferences, including, I think, 3 times in Canada, I was posted there, please translate the science to people like me and the politicians. That's really challenging, and not don't. our ambition is not to understand the science, because that's never going to happen, but understand what we can use this or that scientific result for. It makes it easier for people like me to convince my politicians. If I can say this is what the scientists say, and then they say, what are they saying? And say, I don't have a clue. But that doesn't work, you know, in a political discussion. But again, I think the point is to have the contacts. But of course, if the scientific community come up to the Arctic Hub in Nuuk and says, we need a more treaty or agreement, we will try to see what we can do.
You have a broad agreement on the YouTube chat as well. They're a support of what you're saying there. Cara, do you have a question?
I guess that's connected to what Carl just said. We are climate researchers, ocean researchers. Is there, and he was rightfully asking if there is any way to make essentially to make our work easier, right? Beyond the diplomatic conditions, because if we try and work in the Arctic, in any region of the world, of course, we have to prepare this 3 years ahead and try to get the diplomatic permissions for this. Is there any effort, any strategy, any way to make it easier for us to cross borders, to get diplomatic permissions one way, so that we can just get to a more conclusive picture, you know, at once? That would be wonderful, and we would be able to advise you better. Isn't it?
Yes, but sadly the answer is no. No, I know. Very honest guy. I don't want to stand pretending. And I think that it reaches a bit back to what Duncan say about status quo. Perhaps in some areas, status quo is, let's say, rolling backwards, right? And there is, I think, perhaps a tendency that the national borders become even more important than they used to be, and it get even more difficult to cross to cross borders. And there is a geopolitical situation. Well, China is one thing, but also, of course, between the West and Russia, which is not something that makes diplomatic permissions easier to obtain from either side. So I'm saying, I'm sorry. The answer is that there's no. And again, I know now you will get annoyed with me, but then that's why it's so important that you link. And as you're already doing, you will link up with the scientists from the countries that you're working with, and that is the best way forward. But we have experienced in the past year, let's say, more no's to scientific expeditions than before. And I'm sorry, I don't think that's going to change. Do we have a clear answer? No.
Not the answer you wanted, but the truth nonetheless. Any final questions? Well, Ambassador, we have kept you going for an hour and almost 40 minutes. And so we thank you very much for your time, for your candid, clear and honest answers. And you can all join me in just thanking Ambassador Winkler for his talk today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.